The Second National Front of Escambray was an independent guerrilla group predominantly led by Eloy Manoyo and Dr. Armando Flietes and others in the Cuban central Escambray Mountains. While initially the group supported Fidel Castro and his efforts to overthrow Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista during the revolution from 1957 to 1959, after Castro took power, some of its members joined former Batista soldiers and local farmers in the Escambray Rebellion from 1959 to 65, opposing Castro. The Second Front was a splinter group from the Directorio Revolucionario del Marzo 13, responsible for the coordinated attack on March 13, 1957, on Batista's presidential palace. Manoyo and the National Front of Escambray were the first group to march into Havana on January 3, 1959, as Castro and the 26th of July movement arrived a few days later on January 8, 1959. After the success of the revolution, the National Front of Escambray was absorbed by Castro's army, and many leaders of the movement were considered to be heroes of the rebellion. However, successful National Front members such as Manoyo were not included or offered jobs in Castro's government. These tensions quickly escalated into a resurgence of the National Front movement in the form of the Second National Front of Escambray in September 1959 against Castro once he seized power fully. Upon establishing an anti-Castro movement, Manoyo retreated back to the Escambray Mountains, the base of his last revolution. The movement became popular among farmers who did not support the collectivization that was enforced by the Castro government, leading to the movement targeting agricultural hubs and burning fields in forms of irregular warfare against Castro's government. After Castro announced his ties to the Soviet Union, the United States began to support the National Front in order to oppose the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere. One of the main leading figures in acquiring U.S. aid for the rebellion was William Alexander Morgan, an American who had previously fought in the revolution and joined the anti-Castro movement. Morgan was a former U.S. soldier and acted as the main point of communication between the American government and the Escambray movement. Morgan moved into the position of commander in the movement, and he was favored by the U.S. as a strong opposition leader to Castro and considered a potential transition leader for the Cuban people. However, upon Morgan's capture and execution in March 1961, the movement was dealt its first major defeat. Before Morgan's capture and death, the United States was in close contact with the National Front, formulating a plan to attack the Castro regime directly and restore an anti-communist government in Cuba. In January of 1961, Manoyo took a small group of front members and traveled to Florida to form Alpha 66, an elite division of Cuban fighters and paramilitaries to participate in the planned operation known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. However, they did not participate in the invasion. After the failure of the Bay of Pigs, the U.S. support began to dwindle as the movement was handed its second major defeat in a matter of months. Following a series of tactical defeats, the National Front persisted in operation despite losing two leaders. Manoyo remained in Florida with Alpha 66, and a small collection of leaders maintained organized strikes on farms and industrial outskirts. The period in October of 1962 saw stagnation of the movement operations as strikes became more and more routine. This stagnation was due to a series of defeats of the movement suffered back in 1961, and then the group was prevented from engaging in any major operations from U.S. support as communications with the Americans decreased after the failure of Bay of Pigs invasion. Following the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the conditions of peace between the United States and Soviet Union was for the United States to cut all aid to Cuban insurgencies. This meant that the Second National Front of Escambray would no longer have any American support of any kind. The absence of American aid meant that munitions and medical supplies would no longer be provided, and thus prohibiting the movement from any major conflict, as they would not be able to treat any of their injured against the Castro regime. The final defeat of the movement came in 1964 when Manoyo returned from Florida in December of 1964 to mount a coastal assault in northern Cuba. This resulted in Manoyo being captured by the Cuban government and the leadership of the movement surrendering formally to the regime, ending the Second National Front of Escambray to Castro. During the course of the Escambray Rebellion, the Second National Front suffered between 2,000 and 3,000 killed and 5,000 captured. Meanwhile, the Cuban armed forces saw 500 soldiers killed and over 1,000 wounded, while Cuban militiamen for the communists had 3,500 killed. There was a further 1,000 to 7,000 civilian deaths. Did you know about the Second National Front of Escambray before this video? Would you like to see videos on the Cuban Revolution, Alpha 66, and other Cuban paramilitaries? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.